So, how do we make architecture more like art? That's a sentiment that I see people express in online discourse, and even practicing architects struggle with it. But before we answer that, let me ask you this question first. Why do our lives feel so mundane? Let me tell you about The Sacred and Profane by Mircea Eliade. The sacred is an experience that is at the opposite end of the profane, which can be defined as the mundane, everyday kind of life. Eliade argues that this, the sacred, is the basis for all religion. Quote, man becomes aware of the sacred because it manifests itself, shows itself as something wholly different from the profane. So, if the sacred is something that causes one to stop and take notice, in other words, something that causes us to gaze in awe and wonder, the profane is the homogeneity of normal, quotidian mundaneness. Okay, then, what makes something sacred? With the Church of Light, Tadao Ando exercises what it means for a space to be sacred, but in the modern day. We all know what sacred environments look like in the past. Think cathedrals or chapels. But how this sacredness applies to modern architecture and contemporary architecture is still up for debate. He understood that part of what you need to consider when designing a church is not just function, but spirituality. It needs to convey emotion for it to work. So, he did this in a couple of ways. First off, the cross of light. Soft light diffuses into this crucifix shaped aperture, revealing how, for a Christian, the cross symbolizes hope, light, how it as a symbol doesn't represent death but rebirth. The shadow carves out the light. So even though it's called the Church of Light, it's actually pretty dark. Despair can only be defined by way of its opposite. And if the lines are to have any poetic value, the coloring of the expression must contain the reflection of the dialectical opposite. This can speak to art. The only way to express indescribable things, like despair or like God, is by way of expressing their opposite. The only way to describe light is by drawing its outline out of darkness. But in the context of our current age, this makes the space seem sort of uncanny. You don't expect a public space to be like this, so your subconscious is arrested at this site because it doesn't really know what's going on. Like, for instance, I'm just used to designers just completely flooding a space with light with no regard for mood or atmosphere. They just bombarding all of the senses, just making you feel like you're being like flash bombed. In Praise of Shadows by Junichiro Tanizaki speaks on the importance of shadows in architecture. I really wish I had it. There's this one part in the intro that says something like how In Praise of Shadows was actually a very revolutionary reading because architecture is kind of dominated by a Western or European school of thought. In Praise of Shadows situated Western and European sensibilities as being of light and Eastern sensibilities from Japan or Korea or China as darkness. The book makes a point about how in traditional Asian houses, it draws more attention and preciousness to the sparse amount of light coming in from a garden. So the darkness actually highlights the light. It actually lets it shine. It actually makes it the focal point. He argues that Asian cultures, instead of forcing their idea of beauty onto reality, they sought out to have a sense of beauty and aesthetics that were actually scraped more towards reality's edges. A house in that age would be dark because one would have to go deeply within the thresholds of the house. The roof would be overhanging, the garden would be filtering light. This helps to alleviate severe weather conditions such as the extreme heat or cold, but this means that naturally the house becomes very dark. But they were at peace with that. This made for an environment that was drastically different from what was outside. They made that darkness their home. Returning to the idea of the space awakening your unconscious, there's a structural decision here that contributes to that feeling as well. The crucifix opening extends all the way to the end of the wall, but that means these two concrete walls up here are just floating above this thin panel of glass. Because of this, the structural engineer proposed to just shorten the length at the sides to make it look more like the known symbol of a crucifix. Therefore, like turning what is essentially 4 freestanding walls into just 2 walls with more support on each side. And this is a pretty sensible suggestion. But even with this, Ando still insisted that they keep to his original vision of the project. And, why do this? Why make the construction of the project more difficult for something that is so slight? Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling is a book about the extreme nature of faith. He praises Abraham, the character in the Bible, not for his moral greatness, but for his faith. The book says, "One became great by expecting the impossible, another by expecting the eternal, but he who expected the impossible became the greatest of all." The point that I'm trying to make is that architecture benefits from what others consider struggle. The potential structural disaster does not look that way at all. It's articulated with grace. It looks effortless. Our unconscious minds are unaware of the structural distress, though. It looks like it's not supposed to work, but it does, as if this is the way that things have always worked. Little decisions like these make architecture feel beyond reality, and this is what makes them feel bigger than us. The exquisite and detail-oriented craftsmanship of a cathedral paired with its massive size and multicolored lights, these things feel beyond us. And that is what contributes to that architecture feeling sacred. And it's the same thing in this project, except more subtle. For one to be confident in an idea like this, they must have their mind set on something higher. This is the essence of architecture over building, and the sacred over the profane. Collective effervescence. This is a feeling of being one with a collective, an idea coined by Emil Durkheim. He argued that this is actually what makes up the basis for religion. He believed more that a connection to faith is a connection to each other. It's a connection to your community. The energy that wells up in a place of worship, like when they're singing hymns or supporting community members or something like that, or hearing a sermon, that energy that wells up in there is collective effervescence. And this energy is, to him, beautiful, and it's also addictive. And this is why people get so hooked onto religions. And to quote Tadao Ando, "I was asked to make a palace where people's hearts can come together, united by the light." I mean, Buddhism kind of lends itself to moody, lonely imagery, especially because of the singular use of concrete. That's the only material around. So this instantly makes the space feel kind of lonely and one for solitude, one that kind of echoes how someone would feel if they're kind of in solitude. But actually, the intention for this space was to fill it with community and music. So it seems like this space was designed for collective effervescence, at least keeping that in mind. And this cross of light, this center point that he created by making it the focal point, by carving the light out of all his shadow, I think what he was trying to do was really make for this collective effervescence in this space, especially because what can contribute to the collective effervescence is shadow. Everyone just kind of feeling like they are in one mass of people together. And the shadows kind of help to blur the boundaries between people. It kind of helps you to just lose yourself in whatever spiritual energy is happening in the space. So I believe that Tadao Ando was really trying to make this kind of collective effervescence in this space. This is what I'll say about Tadao Ando's work. I think the most important thing in it, at least the most important thing to him, is connecting people together and also connecting people to nature. For example, in this space, he wants you to experience nature through very simple elements. People think that appreciating nature is typically through looking at a mountain or going on a hike or having a big open garden to look at. But all of Tadao Ando's buildings are in the city. And he said it himself that he considers all of his projects to be about the individual's connection to nature. In these projects in the city that Tadao Ando makes, how does he make them about nature? How does he make someone appreciate nature in these places? To illustrate my point on how Tadao Ando makes people appreciate nature in his buildings despite being an urban environment. Let me show you this project by Raimund Abraham. It's called House with Curtains, but what I prefer to call it is the house for viewing wind. That is how it was introduced to me by one of my professors. And also I think that is what really, I think that title really illustrates what this project is about. This house is a vessel for the observation of nature. There are houses for appreciating like the water, like Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. There are houses for appreciating the mountains. But how about wind? That is also a part of nature. In this house of curtains, it's all subterranean, right? It's all underground, basically. And there are these like glass boxes that are above ground. And when you look up at them, there are these curtains, but they're on the outside. These curtains, as they react to the wind, are going to be fluttering. And, when the wind is going to be particularly strong that day, they'll be going crazy. But when it's a gentle breeze, then you'll just see some more subtle movement. He made it this glass box that's above this underground house for a reason. This is like a really effective vessel for appreciating one of nature's least visible forces, which is wind. Or this house with curtains is a house for appreciating the wind. And that is also a way of appreciating nature. Appreciating nature is a pretty important thing in architecture. Architecture is basically working with the built environment, but having the built environment interact with nature connects you to the natural world and the built environment. It makes it more complete because the built environment on its own is incomplete. The built environment needs the natural world, but the natural world does not need the built environment. Therefore, I think if you're going to make a beautiful building, if you're going to contribute something really beautiful to the built environment, it should have something to do with nature. It should have something to make us appreciate nature. They originally intended for the cross to be open, not closed with glass, so you could feel the wind blowing in from the illuminated cross. However, the pastor at this church was old and the congregation worried for his health, so they put in glass. And apparently Tadao Ando went back often to convince them to take the glass off, but for comfort and health reasons, they wouldn't. For Ando, appreciating nature is through something as simple as feeling the wind or observing daylight. That is because nature is not something that is separate from us. It's not just something to look at or it's not something to go to. Nature is all around us and it is pretty much the fabric of our life. The modern person has a disconnection from nature. He wants to draw attention to that. Like, you can't just turn nature off. Ando felt that there was a severe disconnect from ourselves and the natural world. This natural world, however, feeling connected to it, fosters a deep connection to spirituality. I have speculated that an architect's best project is something like a self-portrait that it says something about the author through design gestures, values, atmosphere, and materials. This project, to me, represents the individual living by his own values and casting his faith on something higher than himself. And something that we do as architects is envision a better world. We envision beautiful buildings that transcend the mundane act of just making a building and fitting people in it. Isn't that what people do with spirituality? They take a mundane, profane life and infuse an indescribable spirituality to it. I mean, wouldn't it just be easier to not care? Yet people do anyway. Life is much more than what you see in front of you. So I think Tadao Ando is saying something about spirituality and architecture. How these things are achieved through atmospheric decisions, such as the way he highlights light with shadow, structural decisions, such as the awakening of the unconscious mind through the cross of light structural design, and by facilitating a connection to ourselves, a connection to the people around us, and a connection to nature. Thank you so much for sticking around this far. I hope you learned something about the rich storytelling potential that is in architecture. Here at Meaningless Architecture, we tell stories through architecture. I know that it's just like concrete and steel to a lot of people, but to us, we try to extract the beauty in aesthetics. We try to embody the philosophy and its concepts and the stories that make up these buildings, that make them more than just buildings. Follow us in the link in the description to learn more about Meaningless Architecture as a project. My name is Myung-hyun, and again, thank you so much for watching this video. Take care. I'll see you next time. Bye.